When talking about AI, I think something that we definitely have to mention is it's very difficult to have this conversation because there's so much hype. A recent study showed that 40% of all European AI startups don't actually do AI. A lot of the companies that do AI actually use ready-made models that are made by some of the world's largest companies. So whenever we talk about AI, we need to keep in mind that there is a lot of hype happening and that not everything that says AI is actually AI. The second misconception, which I think is very important, is that there is sometimes a tendency to portray AI as extremely futuristic, as something that we sort of like historically there's a tendency to call AI everything that isn't there yet. And the moment it becomes normal, like search engines or recommendation systems, we no longer call them AI. So just as a reminder, I think internet users around the world encounter AI on an everyday basis, and I just want to throw out some applications that we sometimes forget that they actually involve AI techniques. So search engines, Instagram filters, Snapchat filters, image recognition, voice recognition, to smart assistants, and obviously face recognition. So in light of these misconceptions, what really is AI? There's a narrow technical definition of the term, but I think over the last years, people use AI in a much broader sense. So people use the word AI to mean a whole range of applications, techniques, at very different levels of autonomy, complexity, and abstraction. So this is just really important to keep in mind. So people use AI to talk about very specific techniques, they talk about machine learning and neural networks. They also talk about very domain-specific AI algorithms. They talk about autonomous and smart objects. Sometimes some people talk about the idea of singularity, which I think we should just exclude from this conversation. But also very often, and I don't know how Shania will talk about this more, in the European and US context, people sometimes lump any form of automated decision-making system under the banner of AI, where sometimes you're really just talking about an Excel sheet or a scoring algorithm. Since we have less time than we thought, I'm going to leave something out. But basically, sort of like, it is important to remember the term is half a century old. But the reason why there's currently such momentum around the topic is, on the one hand, the availability of a lot more data, the availability of affordable and accessible computational power, the continuous development of statistical models, but also, and I think that's a very crucial point, because technology is now embedded in the fabric of society. And I always like to say, technology is neither good, it's not me who said that. The famous quote is always, tech is neither good nor bad, but never neutral, which means that there are undeniable positive consequences or positive things you can do with AI, but there are also considerable risks. And we'll talk about this more at the end of this session, but I already just want to mention some. The first one is, of course, the amount of data that is being used for training purposes that feed into models, but that are also the outputs of models, comes with significant risk for people. There are risks associated with freedom of expression and freedom to information, but also the right to effective remedy, the right to a fair trial, and the right to freedom from discrimination. All of these rights can be negatively impacted by applications of AI. We'll talk about this more later, but I want to turn to Shania and ask sort of, what do you think sort of matters in the concrete context, in the African context? Where is the discussion at the moment, as well as the adoption of the technology?
Thank you so much. One, for the enlightenment on what AI is, and two, for the question of locating it in the African context. So my venture into the artificial intelligence space actually starts from, firstly, the whole trying to understand the search algorithms and what the basis is behind that. I think the first book that I ever read that made me realize that there was such a vast difference in application and context was The Algorithms of Oppression by Safiya Noble, where when you search for black girls, it was, they were always featured as sex images, not as something that was healthy or constructive. But then that's the global north perspective, right? when we're located in Africa, what we actually find is that there is this idea, what we would call a race towards AI, where AI is seen as, once you have the capacity in AI research and you have the technology, it's vital for nations to then become competitive, have more security and economic strength. So the discussions that are happening at a national level are kind of like, once we have AI, we're going to be super brilliant. And then when you look at the actual developer landscape, there is more a startup scenario with most of the designs towards addressing our own local solutions. Now that's fantastic. We have a lot of challenges on hand on the African continent, and having homegrown solutions to address these issues is always brilliant. And what you find is that we have a vibrant AI community with the likes of the Deep Indaba that's been happening, Women in Machine Learning, AIMS, that's the AIMS Institute based out of Cape Town, and also the Alliance for AI. And all of these try to map the AI stakeholders and what is being done in developing local solutions. And I think what's always key to note is how it's so important to have a local context where it's been difficult for AI communities to enter into the European market or Canadian market, as the case we had last year, where people were being denied visas to go to the biggest, language processing conference in Canada. And then you also find that there's a mapping of startups and what it is that they do. And Web Foundation actually did a research in 2018 where they were looking specifically at AI applications in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, which is one of the few researchers towards understanding the AI landscape in Africa, and found that most of the solutions were in finding applications to address the challenges that we have in Africa. Now, because we are actually at a low in tech conference, we also have to talk about the policy aspect, right? Do we actually have an enabling environment that allows for these AI developments, and at the same time make sure that we check these systems so that we don't end up having rapid issues that Frederica has already pointed out? And what you find is that Tunisia is one of the few countries, it's not the only one, that has a national AI strategy. Kenya, which I stand to be corrected, 2018 had an AI task force. South Africa has had a Fourth Industrial Revolution Commission with the aim of actually harnessing AI for economic development and to address unemployment opportunities. It's in this context where you find that the actual framings are more developmental, which is not a major problem, but the challenge becomes that it's sort of now seen as the panacea to all African issues. Once we used to have ICT for D, or we still have ICT for D, now we have AI for D. So now it's that developmental framing of using technology to address the issues we have, but without addressing the cultural and societal nuances that we exist in particular in a continent where internet access and use is still only at 28% overall across the continent. I know Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria, in sub-Saharan Africa, are one of the leading countries when it comes to internet access. For South Africa, it's over half of the population with internet access and use. So you can see that there is this drive for AI for development, but we still have such structural issues that are still not being taken into account when it comes to these issues. So then, as I started touching about regulation and only Tunisia having a national policy, I'm going to throw it back to you, Frederica, to tell us what's the conversation about AI regulation at the global level?
This is very awkward that I constantly have to speak to the microphone. There's been the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard recently mapped all the AI strategies and AI ethics framework that have been published in the last 2 years. And I think it's hundreds and hundreds of AI strategies and ethics principles that have been put out. So there's been a ton of activity in the last year. What many of these, or most of these, I haven't read all of them obviously, but what most of them have in common is they're often very, very high level. So they talk about, as already said at the beginning, AI isn't a clearly defined term to begin with. I think the EU's latest strategy calls basically AI software. And these strategies are all, what they have in common is they're very, very high level. So they talk about AI should be ethical, it should not discriminate, it should respect people's rights, where everybody can agree to this. But it gets really tricky when you ask, so what does it actually mean in practice? Does it mean that governments should use face recognition for policing or not? You can have a discussion about it. I have an opinion on this. Or another question is, we don't want AI to discriminate, but what does that mean if we're faced with systems that are so complex that they're opaque? Should we ban them? What do we do? So all of these, I think my main takeaway is the devil is very much in the detail, and none of these strategies have actually addressed this so far. The second thing that many strategies have in common, which is the very problematic idea that the world is currently in an AI race. There are many reasons why this is problematic, but so the idea is that there's China and there's the US, and then Europe, where I'm from, feels sort of like, oh my God, we're being left out in this race, how are we going to position ourselves? And I think, who says that this is a race? If you're talking about a race, you need to define what the end goal is. How do you measure who's ahead and who's behind? What is the vision of the world that we're moving towards? That's not really clear when people throw out the word race. So that we're in an AI race. So I think that's quite problematic. And there are a lot of proposals that circle around self-regulation. Basically, so the conclusion is, I think, AI does need specific rules. For example, when it comes to privacy and discrimination, the technology really does raise novel questions. But what is often forgotten are the basics. And the basics are the basics of sort of tech policy 101. And this would be data rights, strong data protection and privacy. Many countries around the world either have no laws at all, they're ineffective or not really enforced. Also, the US has completely insufficient regulation when it comes to data. That's one. So if that's not, AI drives on data, if that's not regulated, why do you want to regulate AI? The second point that's very important is consumer protection, strong, enforceable consumer protection. There are many not all, but there are many consumer-facing AI products. And if you don't even know what kind of data your smart speaker collects, there are a lot of smart devices which are being developed in the Chinese market that are shipped to the African continent. What kind of standards should these have? How secure should they be? All of this falls under, for me, consumer protection. Finally, the big elephant in the room is the question of competition law and antitrust. As I mentioned at the beginning, sort of tech is already heavily dominated by a handful of companies. And I think AI will only exacerbate that and make this competition question even more difficult. If you don't have real competition, what's the point of having rules? Trade is really important. A lot of these regulatory questions are being decided in trade negotiations. And finally, I think when it comes to government uses of AI, which is, again, I think that's not specific to AI, it's Tech Policy 101. We need limits and oversight over police use, over intelligence uses, but also, and again, I'm just bringing in European examples because that's the ones I know best. Chennai will bring in other examples. Recently, a court in the Netherlands ruled that the Dutch, again, it's more automated decision-making than AI, but the Dutch government used an automated decision-making system to distribute welfare in the country, and 1 or 2 weeks ago, a court ruled that this system violates human rights. And so there need to be specific rules. If governments start using automated decision-making systems, scoring systems, AI to make decisions about citizens, what are the rules? And I think the baseline should always be, we wouldn't want software by a company that's trademarked, that can't be audited. I think that's a no-go. But there are many more discussions that should be had around this.